Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I'm Mark Hetfield. I'm president of HIAS, which was founded on Ellis Island in 1903 as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And I opened this session on immigration with a Shabbat Shalom, not just because it is Shabbat, but because the commandment to love the migrant as thyself is repeated in the Torah no less than 36 times, which is more often than any other commandment. It's not done this way, in my opinion, because it's more important than any other commandment, but because it's so easily ignored and forgotten. And what we're seeing today, and what we saw in biblical times and ever since, is that even faith leaders and political leaders, mass media, have gone in completely the opposite direction of this commandment. They promote fear of migrants, they otherize migrants, they dehumanize migrants, and we Jews are accustomed to what's known as blood libel, the myth which went around for centuries that Jews kill Gentile children to make matzah out of their blood. Today, migrants are being subject to modern-day versions of this blood libel. Just the most egregious recent example of which is that they're stealing your pets, they're stealing your dogs, they're stealing your cats to eat them. Now, why are we discussing immigration at Halifax, an international security conference? Migration is not a phenomenon that's unique to America. It is a global phenomenon, and so is xenophobia. According to the International Organization for Migration, there are 281 million people worldwide who are living outside of their country of birth or nationality. And only about 1/5 of these are in North America. The rest are spread across the globe. Over 43 million of these are people who fled conflict or persecution. They're refugees, and right now we have more than at any other time in human history. 73% of these, in spite of what many people believe, are being hosted by developing countries. And last year, 8,500 people perished trying to migrate. There are also global conventions related to migration. The Refugee Convention of 1951 and its 1967 protocol are chief among them. But the question for today is, can America be great again if America doesn't greet again? To discuss this question, I'm joined by a number of friends, including Kindertransport survivor, activist, and former HIAS client Manny Lindenbaum, by Roya Hakakian, a writer in English, a poet in Persian, and a former refugee and former HIAS client herself, and by United States Senator Tim Kaine. Now first I want to start with Manny. Manny is now, if you don't mind me saying so, 92 years old. But when Manny was a much younger man of 81, he did his refugee journey backwards on a bicycle from Poland into Germany with his children and grandchildren to raise money for my organization, HIAS, and the children that we assist in refugee camps in Chad. Now, Manny, you were a refugee 3 times, once to Poland, once in the United Kingdom, and then finally in the United States, where you and your brother were brought by HIAS to reunite with your aunt and uncle who were chicken farmers in Toms River, New Jersey. Can you tell us how your refugee experience shaped who you are today?
First, I'm so honored to be here, and I'm so glad that this conference is taking place, because in the world we live in, it's so easy to despair, and this is not about despair, this is about being energized. My grandfather in 1900 in the Ukraine was looking for a place to bring his family. Eventually he had 11 children. And he looked around and he found a place, Hanover in Germany, and moved the family there. And from what I've heard and what I've read that my family has written, well, obviously I wasn't there, they were greeted with open arms. They were greeted by the Jewish community, by the Christian community, and they started a small store which very quickly became large and bigger, and my father moved to the Ruhr Valley, to a town of Unna, and the same thing happened again. The welcome was unbelievable. And I guess, I don't know, I don't quite understand it, but that's everything that I've been told, and even my very earliest memories. And one of my uncles died fighting in World War I for the fatherland. So the family had become Germans. They were Jewish, but they were Germans without any question. And then came the Great Depression. And trains stopped running, people were out of work, and looking for somebody to blame. One party came along and said, you vote for us, and we will make Germany great again. Yeah, I know. And but then they listed what they were going to do. They said that we're going to get rid of the Niedermenschen. Niedermenschen means lower people. We're not going to have people with disabilities because we are special. And we're going to have room to breathe. Our land is going to increase. And they said all these foul things. Among other things, they said they were going to get rid of the Jews, the communists, and they went on with their list. And with all this being said, they were elected, but in a free democratic election. And things very rapidly started to go downhill. My father had a tiny little store. There were 2 tiny apartments above it, and we lived in one of them. And my father had to put a J on his window, and very quickly we became poor. Some people I speak to schools, the kids would say, why don't you just get in your car and get out of there? Well, first of all, we didn't know anybody who had a car. And secondly, America included had closed their doors. There wasn't any place that Jews could go to except under very special circumstances. And as things got worse and worse, 2 weeks before the night of the broken glass, Kristallnacht, they rounded up 17,000 of us, Jews, and the criteria was you had to have a Jewish grandparent and you had to come from the East. And it was on a Friday night, actually, and it was Thursday that they rounded it up. So they held us there till the sun went down. And the only thing I can think of is that these small-minded men wanted to make my blind grandfather travel on the Sabbath. I can't think of any reason why they kept me there for close to 40 hours until the sun went down. And the reason I remember that, he started the Friday night services on the train and broke the tension. When we got to the Polish border, they stopped the train before the station. They got us out of the train, and then with guns and dogs, they chased us to the border. The Polish guards tried to keep us out, but that was fruitless. And then we were in Poland, and we walked about 5 kilometers to a town called Spongen. And I have to say that even as my young memory, we were not greeted with hostility. We were permitted to sleep in the streets, in the horse stables. We found a broken art building. There was 200 of us. We were up on the 4th floor. There was just wooden floors and nothing else in the building. And that was for the next 10 months. For me, as a 6-year-old, this was not the worst time of my life because I was with my family. And somehow or the other, we were able to go out and play, which we were not allowed to do in Germany. And time went on, after 10 months, some people who had contacts were able to get out. We had neither contacts nor money, and we couldn't. And the German army is on the border, and all kind of rumors are going around, and fear. And we're at the railroad station, and that's when the worst day of my life came about. And that's in the midst of this huge crowd of people. My mother shoved me over to a stranger, and she ran and caught a train, and that took off. And there was refugee organizations there helping us. By the way, one of my earliest memories of HIAS is when they brought us cloth bags. So instead of sleeping on the floor, we could put straw in these bags, and so that actually is a warm memory. But it was so my parents were gone. My friends started screaming and hollering, and his mother came back and kissed and hugged him, and I still have that view, as I got angry and took him with her, and they were both murdered in Auschwitz. 2 years later, I found out. That was my friend. So my mother and father, they were heroes in being able, in the midst of chaos, turning me over to this stranger. And when I see views of refugees at borders today, that memories of me came back. And when I heard the separation of children from their parents, I had nightmares for several days after that, because I know that many of those kids who were separated at our border by the American government, by President Trump, will never recover, because it took me 20, 30 years, because I was really a troubled problem kid for everybody for a long period of time, for years. And they got us to the border ahead of the German army coming in, and we got on a Polish troop ship, the Warszawa. I was 7 at that point, and I was there with my brother. They refused to let my 14-year-old sister get on, and I remember I ran away, and she dragged me back and held me down while they shaved the lice off my head and shoved me on board. And I later found out she had managed to find her way across Poland and had rejoined my parents. And the German army came in, and they were all murdered in Auschwitz. And I think my saddest memory is that I cannot really remember my mother and father because I was so angry at them. Well, my sister, she's with me every day. And she's up in that cloud saying, "What did you do to make a difference today?" And that has never left me, and which is very sad. When we got to England, I continued to be in trouble, which lasted for years. But one of the things that stood out for me is the people who reached out, who saw this troubled kid making trouble, even with the police, and somehow or other they would appear. The minister's wife would take me to her house next to the church, and she would give me cookies and a bath, because most of the places I slept in didn't have running water in England. There were quite a few people like that who reached out. And I have taken that as a life's message. When somebody's in trouble and is making trouble, reaching out to them can change their life. And it is such a good thing to be able to do. And you ask me, what did the experience mean for me? I think it gave me the energy that I had to make a difference. And I know when, together with Mark, we walked into Mexico to meet with refugees, the idea that the immigrants, the refugees here, that they're part of gangs. Yes, there's bad people. There's bad people wherever you look, but they're not the problem. The problem is the rest of the people who are quiet. I'll give you one quick story. My brother, as he was dying, and he had a fabulous life, and he lectured all over the world, including my hometown, and he said, everybody says that our sister's alive. Don't spend a lot of time, but go over there. And I went over there. I got local historians to put the story in the front page of the two newspapers. And I ended up speaking to 20 women who said that, her friends. And one after the other, none of them had seen her, but they spread this story. Why did they spread this story? Because they and their families were quiet and hadn't said a word. In the end, if you go to my hometown now, you'll see the memorial to those they killed. And all the names are faded except Ruth, my sister, because they investigated and found out that it was total nonsense. So yes, I would say that my experience has made me look around at refugees, and I speak in schools a lot, but the whole idea of the Niedermensch, of a lower person, it is such a horrible, disgusting thought, because I don't care who you are, you have much more in common with me than you have differences. Thank you.
Thank you, Manny. And Roya, you've written some of my favorite books on immigration, and we've had this conversation before, but the journey from the land of no is interesting because there's actually no journey in the journey from land of no. Like, I hate to spoil it for those of you who haven't read it, but it ends with Roya's family's decision to leave Iran. And then you wrote A Beginner's Guide to America for the Immigrant and the Curious. And that shows, that's basically a guidebook on how immigrants like Roya really see the United States. But you didn't talk about your own actual journey from the time you left Iran till you wrote the Immigrant's Guide. So what happened there, and how was it formative to you?
Great. Well, thank you. And I don't know who scheduled me after Manny, but that was cool. And I'm so glad you're here to talk about the event that apparently to so many young people never happened. So as long as you're here to remind us. Whenever I go to talk about my memoir, the very first thing that most people say is that I'm not old enough to have written a memoir, or I haven't gained the right to write a memoir. And I was very aware of that fact when I sat down to write the memoir, which was that my job was to turn myself into the conduit of a very important piece of history. And that was the events that took place in Iran between 1977 and 1984, which was the most formative years, not just for Iran, but for the region, for the Middle East, and as I'm sure many of you would agree, for the world. And so I thought my job is to make myself useful and use my own story to tell the story of three aspects of history that I thought were being somehow erased from the American accounts of post-revolutionary Iran. The first one was that there was nothing else in Iran other than a group of either radical Muslims who were being identified as the hardline Muslims, or the reformist Muslims, and then there was nothing else in between. So somehow we had been homogenized, and our very, very sophisticated, complex history of a very, very multi-racial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society where the existence of Jews preceded the existence of Muslims was completely being wiped away. So that was number one. And number two that I really wanted to convey in the memoir was the idea that somehow Americans were being convinced that the hijab, as Masih was referring to this morning, was a beloved tradition that Iranians just couldn't wait to embrace. And I thought there has to be a voice that reminds people of the moment when, after the Iranian Revolution, I was a little girl, and the hijab suddenly became compulsory. And, life really became dark and intolerable once we had to do that. So, to make this long story short, I just wrote the first memoir because I was in conversation with America, and I thought that those nuances about the narrative, the complexity of post-revolutionary and pre-revolutionary Iran needed to be injected. And the second book, the Immigrants account, the Beginner's Guide to America, I was just listening to Donald Trump in 2015, and I remember he said, "Our country is full." and he also said, we have to review the history of a lot of these immigrants to whom we have given citizenship, and maybe we should take those, their citizenship back, because depending on where they come from, we ought to do that. And I had been by then a citizen for over 30 years, and I remember panicking so much, thinking, I knew he couldn't do that, but the fear just really set me on fire, and I decided to write a book, not to offer more graphs and more statistics on why immigrants are actually good for our society, but to take people inside the experience of the immigrant, to perhaps reassure them that it is very, very, very difficult for a newly arrived immigrant to go about robbing and raping other people. Because when we arrive, we're just really trying to figure out what's up and what's down. It took me a year or two to just figure out the New York subway system. And so I thought, whoever is buying that argument is unaware of the internal experience of the immigrant. And if I can somehow convey that, perhaps I can be of some sort of service. So I didn't tell the story in between, because nothing within what was going on in the society was compelling me to do so.
Thanks, Roya. And Senator Kaine, I'd like to invite you to respond to what Manny and Roya said, but also one of the questions I'm dying to ask you is, there's not many things Americans agree on, but one thing pretty much everybody in the United States agrees on is that our immigration system, our immigration laws are totally broken and outdated. We haven't passed major immigration legislation in about 30 years. We haven't passed it since we entered the information age. Mm-hmm. So what's going on? Is there any chance that Congress can act and actually reform, update our immigration laws?
Mark, thank you. And what a great place to have this conversation. We were at the pier last night. It was viewed as the Ellis Island of Canada, with more than 1 million people coming into this pier to begin life as Canadians from Europe. 7 of my 8 great-grandparents came from Ireland to the United States in the 1850s, and the 8th was the diverse one, came from Scotland, from a Scottish dad and an Irish mother. But then I had an experience that was the pivotal experience in my formation, which was being a missionary in Honduras in 1980 and 81 in the Northern Triangle, one of the countries that has traditionally produced the most folks who are coming to our southern border looking for refuge here in this country. Why haven't we done something? Can we do something? There's a lot of reasons we haven't done something since the Immigration Reform Bill of 1986, but I'm going to tell you one. Me, politicians, leaders, media, we've got to talk about this issue a little bit differently than the way we've been talking about it. We often talk about immigration as a tug of war between those who want more order and those who want more compassion. Order is needed. Compassion is needed. But we often don't inject a whole other reality that might be a ground on which we could find some agreement. And I'm going to give you 4 stats and stories. Okay, number 1, I am 66 years old. When I was born, Virginia was 1 out of 100 foreign-born, and we were bottom quarter per capita income. Today, we are 1 out of 8 foreign-born, and we're top quarter per capita income. And since 1958, I think only 2 states have made the move from bottom quarter per capita income to top quarter: Virginia and North Dakota. North Dakota, they discovered oil. We didn't discover anything except talent is a resource even more precious than oil. In 1958, women couldn't go to most of our state colleges, and you couldn't go to school with somebody if their skin color was different. And we were very hostile to new Americans, or at least not welcoming. We're not perfect at anything, but we've made a transition where we're welcoming, and guess what? This growth of our foreign-born population has coincided with a dramatic economic improvement. That's number 1. Number 2, what percentage of the American workforce is foreign-born? It's about 18.6% of the American workforce. Nearly 1 in 5 is foreign-born. In Virginia, it's a little less than that, about 16%. What percentage of businesses started in this country are started by people who are foreign-born? It's 25%. Compassion is important, order is important, but our economy needs the immigrant population that's always been the transfusion in our bloodstream that's kept us young at 248 years old. Third story, I just want to give you this industry, healthcare. What percentage of the American healthcare workforce is foreign-born? It's right about that average. It's 18.2%. But it varies all over the map from the high-skilled jobs to the entry-level jobs. 26% of American physicians are foreign-born. And what about the home health care workers that take care of our parents and our grandparents and those with disabilities? 35% of our home health care workers are foreign-born. Our health care system would collapse in a catastrophic and calamitous way without foreign-born workers. And finally, it's a security forum. We are having massive problems in our industrial base in the United States in producing ships and subs and other platforms. The discussion about capabilities, whether it's the war in Ukraine or other necessary engagements and priorities around the world, depend upon our ability with our allies to produce. And we're not producing. We are not producing, and the most significant reason for our underproduction is the workforce. Our unemployment rate is low. Most of you hear from employers, might be the Farm Bureau or the general contractors, the hoteliers or the hospitals. You certainly hear from shipbuilders. We can't hire enough people. We will not be able to meet our defense needs nor our economic needs without immigration reform. I was at a pilot project that I helped get started in Danville, Virginia within the last year. Danville was a manufacturing town, but when the tobacco and textile and furniture sort of went overseas, Danville plummeted. But it's coming back now with advanced manufacturing, and we have a pilot program in Danville to train the next generation of ship and sub builders. And there are workers there from all over the country that come in for these 8-week programs, about 50 at a time. And I walked into the classroom, and these are kids from rural Virginia or rural Washington State, and they're Aussies who were there on an 8-week assignment to help figure out how to shipbuild side by side with Americans because of our AUKUS framework. But the other group of people in class with them were Afghans. We've had about 125,000 Afghans come to the United States under humanitarian parole or special immigrant visa. Many of them have already patriotically worked for the United States. And they've gotten here and they've decided, well, I helped the United States defend itself. I'd like to do it again. And they're there in the classrooms training as shipbuilders. I think we need to talk about it in a different way. The compassion argument, you know, you began, and in your piece in the materials with Old Testament, you know, New Testament, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Joseph and Mary and Jesus fleeing to Egypt. I mean, these are stories that are part of our moral tradition, and we need to emphasize those. And we need to find order at our borders, the U.S.-Canadian border, the U.S.-Mexico border. But we also have to do a better job of talking about the incredible economic dynamism that immigrants create. Because if you ask most Americans, immigration, what's the picture that comes into your mind? It's something that they've seen on the news about the southern border. Not that that's not important, but we would want the picture to come into people's brains that, yeah, okay, it's about the border, but it's also about a way of life and economic vitality and the contributions that are made by some of the folks who were in that opening video, Stephen, which was so good. So we can get this done. And I actually think, the low unemployment rate is going to be the icebreaker that is going to enable us to do this, because every industry wants help with workforce, and most recognize that they can't get the help they need without an immigration reform that focuses on the workforce.
Thanks, Senator. And then I want some advice, because I'm the head of a refugee agency, and frankly, I don't think it's a political statement to say that the first term of the Trump administration was rather difficult for us in terms of our mission, right? And there are three pillars that refugee policy rests on. One is humanitarian assistance overseas. One is allowing people to apply for asylum at our border or inside our borders. And the third is refugee resettlement, which is Manny and Roya were resettled here from overseas as refugees. Humanitarian assistance in the first Trump term, he tried to slash, but Congress prevented it from happening. And so it actually continued. So that was good. Are we going to see that again? Can we see that again? Second question, asylum. Is there any space for asylum in the United States, given the situation at the border and given President-elect Trump's promise to immediately end the migrant invasion of America? And he counts asylum as being a part of that strategy. And third, he has promised to suspend refugee resettlement on day one, on his first day in office, which is, of course, a legal and orderly way to bring refugees into the United States. And it's a program that has always had bipartisan support up until relatively recently. So what's our strategy?
My prediction on number one, humanitarian assistance, there will continue to be budgets submitted that would drastically reduce it. My Republican and Democratic colleagues in Congress will make sure that we don't do that and we save it. We saw that last time, we'll see it again. With respect to the asylum process, we have to maintain an asylum process. Now look, I do think there is some more order needed in the process. And some of the executive actions taken by President Biden, for example, which are controversial with many, but I think they say, look, prioritize people who are seeking asylum, who come to either apply outside the boundaries of the United States or come to ports of entry and apply. And prioritize those over those who would cross the border between ports of entry and, if picked up, then make an asylum claim. I think that's a way to put order into the system. And it also speaks to a reality that I understood pretty well from my time living in Honduras. Most people who come to the United States and come to our southern border from the Americas, there are those who are subject to persecution who would meet the asylum standard traditionally. But the vast majority are coming for economic opportunity. And that is not a criteria for receiving asylum status. The nation doesn't have good work visa rules. We don't have the kind of robust work visa programs that we used to. And so people know if they come, they probably won't get in if they're saying that they're seeking economic opportunity, which then leads them to apply in convoluted ways for asylum status, gumming up the court process for asylum status with cases that years later are often adjudicated, well, no, you don't meet the asylum status. If we had a more robust work visa program that would speak to this economic need we have now, you would take a lot of people who are coming here and gumming up the asylum process. You would give them a legal path where they could come work, pay taxes, send money back home. And then you'd shrink the numbers on asylum to something that could be managed by the court system that we have. So I think there are some reforms that are needed, but we definitely need asylum. And on refugee resettlement, I will fight tooth and nail. I will fight tooth and nail against any efforts to stop refugee resettlement. The Catholic church that I go to in Richmond, Virginia, St. Elizabeth of Hungary, was established right after World War I by Italian immigrants who felt discriminated against because of feelings about World War I. And so they needed a safe haven, and they created this church in the early 1920s. St. Elizabeth's of Hungary, 101 years later, in Richmond, Virginia, is the same church, even though it's completely different. It's now 35% Congolese refugees who've been resettled through the Diocesan Resettlement Office. So it's the same church in some ways as it was 101 years ago. And the contributions these Congolese families have made to our parish and to our community are inestimable. We have to have a refugee resettlement program, and I'll do everything I can to enlist every colleague I have to make sure that we continue to be true to that. It's not a burden, it's not an obligation, it's not a duty, true to that joyful responsibility that we have.
Thank you. Now, in developing the agenda for this year's Halifax, you saw there were two competing agendas. And this particular session had two proposed titles. One, the one you got, was Era of Opportunity, Immigrants Excel. The other one was Era of Dread, Immigrants Extinguished. My question for each panelist is, did they choose the right title? Roya.
It is not the wrong title, but it's a reductive title. In that, I think the moment we separate the issue of immigration from everything else that's going on, especially democracy, is when we lose sight of the fact that if democracy is lost, we get more immigrants at our borders. And so if we, rather than worry about what kind of wall we need to build, the strongest, best wall you can build in order to keep immigrants out is the wall of democracy in other parts of the world. An example, in 1977, 1978, there were 100,000 plus Jews who lived in Iran, Christians who lived in Iran, Baha'is who lived in Iran, all sorts of people whom you have helped throughout the years. That number today stands at 8,000. And the reason that the Jewish community's numbers have dwindled so much isn't just because there's anti-Semitism in Iran. Anti-Semitism is everywhere. But it's the fear and the anxiety and the absence of what Iran was at one point, which was a multi-ethnic, multicultural society, a society with certain civil liberties that has been lost, that has driven those numbers. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to make sure that we always make the connection that wherever the United States takes a step back from taking part in assuring the security or the democracy potential of other nations is the moment we will, at one point or another, see new immigrant populations flooding our gates. And so we have to assure that we continue to play a part in trying to support not just the democratic movements, but also the intactness of those civil societies before they fall apart. And I think Syria is the best example. And I think one third issue that's really key, and I think it's one of the foundational failures of our national conversations about the issue of immigration, is what Senator Kaine referred to, which is this dichotomy that has been created between fear and pity, and nothing else in between. So you either fear the immigrants or you pity them, and there is nothing else in between. There is nothing to say, we're going to be careful in processing and choosing and allowing these immigrants into our country, so we make sure that we keep away the people who need to be kept away. And those people who say, open borders and let's open our arms and they're welcome to come in. And as long as we are caught in this dichotomy where half of the nation isn't convinced that the other half cares about the security, we will be stuck. And so we need to find a way through. And the progressives have a lot that they really need to recognize have done wrong in advancing or hindering this debate from being advanced. And I can cite one example, which is that I wrote a long piece about a few weeks ago about an Iranian former ambassador to the United Nations who had been at the United Nations during the time when one of the largest massacres against the population of political prisoners in Iran took place. Thousands of political prisoners had been killed over the span of a few weeks. Now, this guy who had denied these crimes while he was an ambassador at the United Nations had somehow landed at Oberlin College as a professor of peace and friendship studies. Mm-hmm. How do you go from holding that position to being a professor of peace, forgiveness, and friendship studies within the span of several years, and also receiving an American citizenship? I and a lot of other people, many, have undergone the citizenship process. People have asked us on the forums whether we have been affiliated with, parties that were anti-American, whether we've been affiliated with organizations, this, that, the other. We've been vetted and we've undergone such scrutiny to prove that we have never had any sort of affiliation with any anti-American entity. So how does that person receive a US citizenship and end up a tenured professor? So just to summarize, I want to say that we have lost the trust of part of America because we have allowed these breaches to occur, and we deny some valid sense of fear that people have. And as long as we can't address both these issues and break out of the dichotomy, we will not be able to advance the immigration debate.
Thank you. And we only have 12 minutes left, so I'm going to open it to the audience. So let's see, Dixon.
Thank you, Mark. Dixon Osborne with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. President-elect Trump has said that he's going to invoke the Emergency Act, the Insurrection Act, deploy the military to round up millions of immigrants, probably coordinating then with local law enforcement. The question is, and at our own organization, we've already seen an uptick in threats of violence by militias, or so-called militias, and by white supremacy groups that are eager to support this effort. The question is, where do our immigrants turn? How can they find safety in this moment that they fear?
Well, HIAS and other groups will play an important role into where should folks turn, but I mean, I'm going to do everything I can with colleagues to block the use of military and any roundup, et cetera. And there will be Republicans who will join me in this. Rand Paul, for example, came out immediately and said that would be a very improper use of the American military. And I believe there will be others that will take that position as well. This is a security forum. I mean, how is this for a recruiting environment into an American military that is already struggling, questioning the value of women who serve? The current nominee for the SecDef has done that, and suggesting that those who serve will now be given the task of rounding up people on the street to deport them. This is going to make it much more difficult for us to get our best and brightest to come into the military, in my view. So it's a question about immigration, not about the military, but this is a security forum. We're already having recruiting problems. It would get much worse if we do it. So we have to fight against that very, very strenuously, and I will. The question is, where should folks turn?
Yeah, and I was just talking to my, HIAS works through Jewish family service agencies around the country, and this was a focus of our conversation, and I'm sure Lutheran Social Services, Catholic charities are having the same conversations, which is this will be a new form of family separation, because many families are mixed families. There may be undocumented as well as U.S. citizens in those families. So we have to find out like how to protect oneself from removal, because the president's also going to expand his expedited removal authority to cover the entire United States, really giving him the authority to remove people with basically no due process. So they need a place to turn. And so our refugee resettlement networks will have to transform into giving advice as to how you can protect yourselves and then how you protect your families after a removal has occurred.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Where I live in New Jersey, the Hispanic people who have come into town and have taken jobs like crazy, wherever you go, they're starting businesses all over the place, and they are about as nervous could be.
Yeah.
I mean, wherever you look, they're starting new businesses, they're taking jobs, and they're not taking jobs away from other people because there's a labor shortage, and they don't know where to turn, and they're very nervous.
Yes, sir? Yeah.
Here comes one, yeah.
Senator, I'm going to quote 2 sentences you made. You said the economy needs the immigrant transfusion. You also said the healthcare system will collapse without foreign-born workers. Mm-hmm. So before I came to Halifax, I went to visit my father-in-law in Lagos. He was ill, and my wife wasn't happy with the treatment he was getting elsewhere. So she brought him to Lagos. And when I met him, he said it was like a magic, right? Because the doctor looked at him, looked at all the drugs he was taking, and advised him, and the change has been actually magical, almost like a miracle. Mm. I was really happy for him and his story, but on my way home, I couldn't get the fact that that doctor was going to be on his way out of Nigeria anytime soon. My name is JJ Omojua. I'm from Nigeria. Mm-hmm. I'm also on the board of Halifax, just to give perspective. Mm-hmm. I was really scared of that, and I quoted you because the other side of those sentences is the poor countries that are often on the receiving end of that economy in these rich countries, that healthcare system in these rich countries not collapsing. And the interesting thing is, when we have these conversations, we hardly have them from the POV, from the point of view of those poor countries. And I do believe that when we have these conversations from the point of view of those poor countries and the effects of migration, of immigration on these countries, I believe we'll get closer to the solution, because we get closer to the root causes than the effects that we're generally discussing. Because whatever we're discussing with respect to how it affects immigration in places like the United States, those are the causes. The roots of the matter are actually from the countries that are also losing.
Great point.
From the gains that you just mentioned. So how do we address these issues from the POV of poor countries? Because only then do I believe that we'll arrive at a more robust
Can I restate that just to make sure I understand?
Yes.
I think I get this. If I'm saying 26% of American physicians are foreign-born, and I'm thinking, thank God these foreign-born physicians are doing such a great job. But you're raising the point, but why aren't they practicing in the countries where they were born? What is it about systems there that lead them to decide I'm going to practice in rural Virginia rather than Nigeria, another place? And so something that has been a positive for us ends up being a brain drain or a negative for other countries. Is that, do I basically?
Yes, 100%.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's a great question. And if you dug deeper into that 26%, the reason that 26% is in the United States, there's probably 1,000 reasons. You know, I came to school, or I married someone and moved here, or I had family who lived here. But in many, it would be there were no opportunities, or I had better opportunities here. And then you end up with a public health system in so many nations that doesn't have the providers that it needs. One of the things that I think we need to do as we think about humanitarian assistance in the medical field, just using that as an example, is rather than investing, purely in NGOs that are going in to do good, we have to invest in building up the public health infrastructure of nations that don't have sufficient healthcare providers. And so the humanitarian assistance is important, but you got to do it the right way, not the wrong way. You know, we used to do food assistance by just sending food. You actually do a better job if the food assistance is heavily about cultivating local agriculture. And I think probably there's a similar strategy that we have to pursue as we think about public health systems in developing nations. Thanks for asking that.
In the case of Iran, if I may, the brain drain occurred each time the internal movements that took place for greater freedom and liberty failed. So I just want to emphasize.
Linking to democracy.
Exactly. That if Iran had been able to, in 2009, during the Green Movement, do a recount of the vote and send the right person who had actually been elected to office, thousands of people, educated Iranians, would not have left. So yes, there is absence of opportunities, but in a lot of places, it's also absence of democracy.
Okay. Yes.
Hello, I'm Mauricio Meshlan from the Mexico Research Center for Peace. My question would be, Donald Trump said that on the first day, the first thing he's going to do in office is call the new Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, and let her know that if she doesn't stop the migration, he will put 25% tariffs immediately. So what would be a recommendation for the Mexican government to work properly with the new administration so that we can actually work together for advancing the mutual goals?
Mauricio, that is a very good question. I mean, a brand new president from Mexico that I haven't yet met. I don't know whether my colleagues have yet had the opportunity to meet with President Sheinbaum. But I do think in my interactions with President AMLO, he was often, he was an unpredictable guy in a million ways, but he was often giving, I think, fairly good advice to the administrations, the Trump and Biden administration, about here's the challenge you have on the border, and here is what you need to do. And he often would say, if the overwhelming number of people are coming to seek work, but you don't have a good work visa program, then you're going to complicate your asylum. And so he has advocated, as have other heads of state in the Americas, for the notion of a better work visa program to take the pressure off asylum. So, just because President Trump said, I think it was Jim Risch who said, when the president says something on day one, it might be like a day in the book of Genesis. It could have lasted 1,000 years or something like that. So it may not happen on day one, but it will be an early priority. And I think the Mexican response should be, we understand this problem in some ways even better than you do. And the way we understand it is there are ways that we can help you manage this. Right now, the numbers have come down in the last few months in a fairly significant way after the president's executive actions that began in May of 2023. Sometimes they come down for a while and then people figure out new ways, especially the traffickers, new ways around the new rules. But how about analyzing, well, it's kind of working right now, so why is it working? Can we do more of it? I mean, I think it could be a very productive discussion.
Okay, last question.
Hi, Wagner Maradian from Defense and Aerospace Report. Mark, terrific panel. Manny, incredible story. Yeah. Roya, thank you. And Senator Kaine, thank you for your service. My question would be, we're talking tactics. How do we deal with, an immediate 500,000 or 12 million or whatever the number is, or how do we change the dialogue about this? One side is communicating on a completely different level. We're talking about us here, and we all understand the problems and the solutions, have family stories that mirror some of these. How do you change the narrative at a strategic level that immigrants aren't here to kill you in the night? We should have an organized process. There shouldn't be chaos at the border. How do you change this fundamental narrative that's so key to us being Americans? Thank you.
Do you guys have thoughts?
Everybody's looking at everybody else, so I think you're absolutely correct. Somehow the narrative is broken, because even when I think about the phrase in the title of this panel, Immigrants Excel, The first thing that came to my mind is that not necessarily. I mean, my father came and he never worked in this country. He collected welfare for as long as welfare was being, allotted to him. And he was writing poetry about how much he missed Iran on a single day, every single day of his life. And when 9/11 happened, and I've written about this, my father shuffled out of our apartment in Queens, New York, went around the corner. I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "I'll be right back." He went to a store around the corner. He came back with a plastic bag, and he had bought the most giant American flag you have ever seen in your life. And my father had never held a flag, waved a flag of any country in his entire life. And he hung it on the balcony of our apartment on 9/11, like 3 hours after the planes had hit. So we misunderstand immigrants because when they don't speak English or when they don't work, we think that they're useless. They're not. They're here in America to keep the composition of the American DNA healthy. We need an infusion of people from countries like the story of Manny, like authoritarian, refugees, to remind the rest of us why democracy isn't about every 4-year election, that democracy is something much more minute that manifests itself in everything that we experience on a daily basis. If we, all of us as Americans, or at least the majority of us, stop at a red light, it's because we live in a democracy. Because if you go to Tehran, nobody stops at a red light, right? And it's not because red light is something else that it's not in New York. It's the same red light. But when the foundations of a social contract is broken in one part of the world, it doesn't matter how many rules you impose. So all I'm trying to say is that somehow we have failed to understand that if we lose our immigration, we lose our Americanness. And hire every PR firm there is in our country and put them on the project of reversing this narrative. Because we need to be that America that's the nation of nations.
Can I give a prose answer? That was a poet's answer, right? That was a poet's answer. I think a prose answer for the legislators is when we do an immigration bill, and I think the low unemployment rate and the demand of our employers is going to push us so that we have to really talk about it as a workforce-based immigration bill. I was so proud to be part of the immigration bill that we did in the Senate in 2013. I was in my first year as a senator. I was really naive. I thought when we passed it with 70 votes, even though the House was Republican, they'd pass something different. We'd split the difference and we'd get a good immigration bill. It didn't happen. It was the comprehensive, it was everything in that bill. We're going to have to do an immigration reform bill and have it very focused on workforce. Not that we can't do some of the adjustments in asylum and others, but if we really lead with the economic and workforce argument and break out of the way you said it, sort of is it fear or pity, or is it compassion or order? We got to break out of the old dialogue and make it about kind of economic dynamism. And if the bill that we will do, that will pass, will lead with that. And I hope it's sooner than later. We need it.
I know that every statistic that I've seen about crime and immigrants, that the local population, the crime rate is higher. Naturally, there are bad people in every group, but the statistics are that immigrants commit less crime percentage-wise than the local population. Everybody doesn't have to agree with me. Go check the numbers.
Well, thank you, everybody. I feel better. I don't know about you, but I feel better.